So let's talk a little bit about the moth and the flame metaphor, which is an analogy to the phenomenon of spirituality and seekers of truth, basically. So it is seekers of truth who are on the spiritual path, usually. And the search for truth is driven by the duality of fear and desire, which lead to suffering. The repeated encounters with fear and desire are what make one aware of one's own suffering and sows the seed of the spiritual search or the pursuit of enlightenment, which is the desire, the process of going beyond suffering. Because the definition of enlightenment is basically the end of suffering. So, the source of suffering is basically ignorance, which is the fundamental error of taking I to refer to the body and the mind alone. So, this is the first axiom basically of life for most human beings, that I refers to the body and the mind, as we've discussed before. And the body and the mind basically are subject to limitation and apparent separation from the rest of the cosmos. And therefore, it lives in a state of constant threat and dissatisfaction. But the only way to end this constant sense of threat and dissatisfaction is to realize infinity and perfection, eternity and perfection now, because eternity implies the unreality of death, which puts an end to the fear of death, and perfection implies the unreality of dissatisfaction, which puts an end to the sense of lack, and fear and desire are therefore destroyed. But since the apparent separate ego or body mind identity derives its very existence from separation, it cannot survive without fear and desire. So, if the absolute truth is realized, which it is realized by the absolute truth, not by a separate body mind, because the separate body mind is an imaginary limitation that the absolute truth imposes upon itself. So, if the absolute truth is realized, the separate self is terminated, annihilated instantaneously, and that puts an end to fear and desire. So, the analogy with the moth and the flame is basically that the moth is helplessly attracted to the flame, but if it enters the flame, it is pulverized. So, the ego is exactly like this. The only thing the ego wants is perfection, which is the end of limitation, the attainment of infinity. But the attainment of infinity implies the end of the finite, apparently separate identity that the ego clings to. So, the flame is the flame of truth, and the moth is the moth of the ego. And in the flame of truth, the ego is pulverized. So, the moth of the ego is attempting to enter the flame of truth. But the final entry into that flame of truth is the end of the ego. And that is what the ego fears. Therefore, the ego simultaneously craves enlightenment and is petrified of enlightenment. So that's the moth and the flame metaphor, which is an effective way of describing the phenomenon of the spiritual search.